It was an afternoon in April 2002, when millions of people filled the streets of Caracas. The air was thick with chants of "Chavez renuncia," "Chavez resign." Television stations had gone silent, replaced by patriotic music or blank screens. Army trucks rolled through the capital. Soldiers stood watch at every intersection, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the Bolivarian revolution was over. Just hours earlier, Hugo Chávez, Venezuela's fiery populist president, had been arrested by his own military officers. For years he had defied the country's old elites and challenged the most powerful empire on earth, the United States. But now it seemed his time was up. That same night, a businessman named Pedro Carmona, head of Venezuela's largest employers association, declared himself the new president. Within minutes, the US government officially recognized him. To many, it felt as though Washington had been waiting for this very moment. But this story, like all stories of empires and rebellion, did not begin that day. To understand why Venezuela erupted, we have to go back decades, to the time when the country's enormous oil wealth was both a blessing and a curse. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the world's richest oil producers. Its wells supplied fuel to the United States, its cities gleamed with modernity, and its elites enjoyed European lifestyles. But beneath that wealth lay a sea of poverty. In the 1980s, global oil prices collapsed. The Venezuelan bolivar lost its value. Ordinary citizens saw their wages disappear, while the rich moved their money abroad. Successive governments, controlled by two old political factions, Acción Democrática and COPE, kept swapping power, promising reform but delivering only corruption. Amid that despair rose a young military officer with piercing eyes and a gift for oratory, Hugo Rafael Chávez Frias. He believed Venezuela had lost its soul. The country's oil, he said, belonged to the people, not the oligarchs. In 1992, he led a failed military coup against the government. It was a desperate, almost suicidal act. But when he was captured, something unexpected happened. On live television, the young officer, handcuffed and calm, took responsibility. "For now," he said, "our goals have not been achieved." Those two words, por ahora, became a symbol of hope for millions of poor Venezuelans who had long been ignored. 6 years later, in 1998, Chavez ran for president. His campaign was simple but powerful: end corruption, share the oil wealth, and build a new Venezuela based on social justice. The people responded. He won in a landslide. The Bolivarian Revolution, as he called it, had begun. Chavez moved quickly. He rewrote the constitution, nationalized key industries, and launched massive social programs known as missions. With oil money pouring in, he built schools, clinics, and housing for the poor. Illiteracy plummeted, healthcare expanded, and millions felt hope for the first time in generations. But Chavez also made enemies, powerful ones. The old elites, the media, and business magnates accused him of turning Venezuela into a dictatorship. The United States, which had long considered Venezuela its reliable oil supplier, was alarmed. Chavez openly befriended Fidel Castro in Cuba, spoke of socialism for the 21st century, and denounced U.S. imperialism. For Washington, this was unacceptable. A Latin American country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves had just turned against them. By early 2002, tensions reached a boiling point. Opposition leaders organized a massive general strike. Protests erupted. The private media broadcast anti-government propaganda around the clock. In April, parts of the military rebelled. They surrounded the presidential palace and arrested Chavez. As news spread, U.S. officials immediately signaled support for the coup. Otto Reich, a senior American diplomat, had reportedly met with Venezuelan businessmen and opposition figures days before. Pedro Carmona, the US-backed businessman, declared himself interim president. One of his first acts was to dissolve the National Assembly and the Supreme Court. That decision proved fatal. The very institutions that had tolerated the coup now turned against him. On the streets, tens of thousands of poor Venezuelans, Chávez's loyal supporters, rose in anger. Soldiers who remained loyal to Chavez joined them. Within 47 hours, the coup collapsed. Carmona fled. Chavez returned to the presidential palace in triumph. That moment changed everything. The man who had once been a populist became, in the eyes of millions, a revolutionary hero. The failed US-backed coup gave Chavez legitimacy beyond question. He tightened his grip on power, reshaped the military, and consolidated control over the state oil company, PDVSA. Now it truly belongs to the people, he declared. Over the next decade, oil prices soared, billions flowed into Venezuela, and Chavez used that wealth to export his revolution across Latin America. He forged alliances with Bolivia's Evo Morales, Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega, and Cuba's Castro brothers. Together they formed ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, an anti-US bloc meant to counter Washington's influence. Chavez dreamed of a multipolar world where Latin America stood on its own. But behind the fiery speeches and red shirts, cracks began to show. The Venezuelan economy became dangerously dependent on oil. Corruption spread through government ministries. State control stifled private enterprise. Inflation rose. Yet Chavez's charisma held the country together. To his supporters, he was more than a president. He was the embodiment of dignity, the man who had stood up to America and won. In 2012, cancer struck him. He fought it publicly, vowing to return to power. But on March 5, 2013, Hugo Chávez died at the age of 58. Venezuela wept. Millions poured into the streets to bid farewell to El Comandante. The revolution had lost its father. Before dying, Chavez named his successor, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and loyal ally. In 2013, Maduro won the presidency by a narrow margin, but the global tide was turning against him. Just a year later, oil prices collapsed again. Suddenly, the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy dried up. Without oil revenue, the social programs faltered. Inflation spiraled. Basic goods vanished from store shelves. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Electricity blackouts became routine. Millions of Venezuelans began to flee, walking across borders into Colombia, Peru, and beyond. Washington seized the moment. Under President Obama, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuelan officials, accusing them of human rights abuses. But it was under Donald Trump that the economic war truly began. In 2017, the U.S. banned Venezuelan oil exports, froze government assets abroad, and pressured international banks to cut ties. The goal was simple: break Maduro's power by strangling the economy. But instead of collapsing, Maduro adapted. He made the military a direct stakeholder in the economy, giving generals control over oil, food distribution, and mining projects. Their loyalty was now tied to his survival. Then on January 23, 2019, the United States unveiled its boldest move. A young opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, stood in a Caracas square and declared himself interim president. Within hours, Washington and its allies recognized him as Venezuela's legitimate leader. Billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets were transferred to Guaidó's control. The plan was clear: trigger a military coup. But it never happened. The generals stayed loyal to Maduro. Russia, China, and Iran provided intelligence and logistical support. Cuban advisors fortified the presidential guard. Even as the economy collapsed, Maduro remained in control. The U.S. tried new tactics. In February 2019, American officials organized a so-called humanitarian aid convoy on the Colombian border, hoping Venezuelan soldiers would defect. The attempt failed. Maduro closed the border and accused Washington of using aid as a pretext for invasion. By 2020, Guaidó's movement had crumbled. Corruption scandals eroded his credibility. Then came one of the strangest episodes in modern history: Operation Gedeon. A group of mercenaries, including 2 former U.S. soldiers, attempted to infiltrate Venezuela by boat and kidnap Maduro. They were captured almost immediately. Photos of their passports and weapons were broadcast on state television. Around the world, the plot became a laughingstock. But beneath the satire lay a grim reality. From 2013 to 2023, Venezuela's GDP fell by nearly 80%, a collapse comparable to that of nations devastated by war. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled their homeland, one of the largest migrations in modern history. Sanctions intended to weaken the government instead crushed the people. Food shortages, malnutrition, and disease surged. By 2022, even Washington began to rethink its strategy. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, global oil markets were thrown into chaos. The Biden administration realized that isolating Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, was no longer practical. Quietly, U.S. officials reopened communication channels with Maduro's government. In exchange for easing some sanctions, they demanded political concessions and fairer elections. But the geopolitical landscape had changed. Russia and China had stepped into the void. They provided loans, weapons, and technology, shielding Venezuela from Western isolation. For Moscow and Beijing, supporting Caracas was not just about oil, it was about defying American dominance. Venezuela, once seen as a failed state, became a symbol. In Latin America, many saw it as proof that even under crushing pressure, a nation could resist U.S. hegemony. Chávez's dream of an independent continent still flickered. Yet, the struggle was far from over. In recent years, Washington's pressure has intensified again. The Trump faction within American politics calls for maximum pressure. Sanctions remain. American warships patrol the Caribbean under the guise of anti-narcotics operations, a thinly veiled military blockade. At the same time, Western media and institutions have tried a new narrative war. The Nobel Peace Prize was controversially awarded to Maria Corina Machado, a right-wing Venezuelan politician who openly called for foreign intervention. To many Venezuelans, this was hypocrisy at its finest. The same person who once urged the U.S. to invade was now being celebrated as a champion of peace. Recently, she even congratulated Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu on his Gaza campaign, deepening the irony. Today, Venezuela stands at a crossroads. Its economy is wounded, its people divided, yet its sovereignty intact. The Bolivarian revolution, born out of poverty and defiance, has survived coups, sanctions, and conspiracies. For more than 2 decades, Washington has tried every tool, economic, political, and covert, to unseat Venezuela's leadership. But each time, the revolution has endured. The story of Chavez and Maduro is not merely the story of 2 men. It is the story of an entire nation refusing to kneel. It is the story of a people who, despite hunger and hardship, refuse to let outsiders choose their destiny. And as the world watches, one thing is certain: the battle for Venezuela is far from over. Because some revolutions once born refuse to die.